So let's go ahead and get started. My name is James M. Branum, and I'm here at Joy Mennonite Church, where we are having this training today. And I'll mention that for those of you watching online, we have folks here from Joy Mennonite. We also have some folks here from from a local Episcopal church, and of course, we have folks from around the world tuning in. I know we have some folks from Lubbock Unitarian Fellowship, several Mennonite churches, and we have a lot of other people who will be watching later in recorded form. So I really appreciate everyone being here today. We also will have another guest, so we'll be speaking in a little bit as well, Edward Hasbrouck. Ed was a draft registration resistor, meaning he was one of the very few people who refused to register for the draft when Jimmy Carter reinstated it. And he actually went to federal prison, is my understanding, because of that. So he'll be sharing about his experiences, but especially what I'm really asking him to focus on is talking to his work since then has been focused largely on tracking the selective service system, understanding how it works. So he's going to be explaining that in more detail, but particularly how the selective service system handles draft registration right now. And we'll be handling things starting in December of this year. So I'm going to have him in just a little bit. But before I go on, I do want to thank our groups that have helped make this possible. Joy Mennonite Church for providing this space and for being a very strong partner throughout this whole project. We really appreciate Joy Mennonite Church. Also, the Oklahoma Objector community has provided some of the infrastructure support for making this happen. Also want to give a big thanks to some of the folks who helped promote this training, get it out there. That includes the Military Law Task Force, the National Lawyers Guild, the Western District Conference, the Mennonite Church USA, and Anabaptist World Magazine. Thank you so much for plugging this event, helping us get the word out there. We really appreciate that. So a few housekeeping things before we go on. For those of you on Zoom, we do ask you to keep your mics muted unless you're talking, just to control background noise. If you do have questions along the way, please put them in the chat. We have Jamie who's going to be monitoring the chat, and periodically throughout the presentation, there will be some time for questions and answers. And so I'm going to ask her when we have questions. For folks in the room, there's some pieces of paper on the tables and some pens. So write your questions on those and then hand them to Jamie. And she's sitting in the back there at the little table. And again, she's going to be feeding us the questions, but also we expect there may be more questions than we can answer in these 2 hours. And so if that's the case, if we have those questions, then we might be able to use some of those, answer some of the questions in the upcoming training, our 201 and 301 classes coming up. Also, for those of you here in person, if you don't know, the bathroom is you go through towards the kitchen in the back by the back doors where the bathroom is. Feel free to get up anytime you want a snack or a drink. We have some snacks in the other room. And again, if you have questions, write them on the little card. So with that out, the housekeeping out of the way, let's get into this presentation. So I want to begin by saying that this presentation is designed with a very specific intent, which is to revive the concept of draft counseling for a new time. And I think for myself, the reason this feels so critical, we have two things really cooking that to me has changed the seriousness and the risk of a potential draft. First of all, Congress has been busy. Congress passed a law that changed how draft registration works. I'm not going to tell you about it right now. We're going to let Ed explain that. But that to me tells me that Congress is up to stuff. And that tells me that the risk of a draft actually happening is higher because Congress has the role in the end of when to pull the trigger and actually initiating a draft. So anytime we see Congress actually doing things to make the draft registration system more effective, it means the risk is going up. But secondly, let's be frank, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the President of the United States. His administration has behaved in erratic and unpredictable ways. All of the conventional wisdom many of us had of saying, oh, a draft is not really seriously on the table. No politician would possibly want to do that. All bets are off with the current administration. Now, obviously, this is put together by a nonprofit group. So this isn't about electoral politics, but from an political analysis standpoint, we have to be realistic and say that the risk of anything happening is much higher right now, and we need to be ready. The good news is we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to create something that has never existed before because we have a model already in place, and that is draft counseling, a model that has been used since the Vietnam War. And it it was a time when ordinary people from all walks of life got trained, and so they could help their fellow human beings. And these are people from all walks of life, religious folks, students, teachers, you name it. So many people were involved. In fact, one of the interesting things and by the way, this was a nationwide movement that happened, but was especially interesting is I did a little checking in getting ready for this presentation, looking at what draft counseling looked like in Oklahoma historically. So I'm going to share a screen for a moment. So I'm going to show just a few news clippings I found in the Oklahoman archive. And the dates of these, several from 1969, 1970, 72, and 1980. Now, what's especially significant is you have to remember the Daily Oklahoman in those days was extremely conservative. So the fact that these stories got attention at all is significant. Now, also note they will focus more on the controversy about them. For instance, this first story from 1969 tells about controversy in the Presbyterian Church about a draft counseling program. We have another story. Oh, this one, I'm going to just read this a little bit because this is very interesting. Also, this one's from December 14th, 1969. It says, Concert Aid Service, draft counselors helped. A permanent draft counseling service for students at Oklahoma City University received a financial boost Saturday night in the form of a folk rock music concert in the school's Kilpatrick Fine Arts Auditorium. 5 rock bands and 8 individual vocalists donated their service for the concerts, delayed nearly 2 hours by a telephoned bomb threat. More than 150 persons, many sporting hippie-style clothing and hairdos, again, this was the Oklahoman, paid $1.50 each to attend the concert. Dick Meyer, OCU Jr., said the draft counseling service has been in operation on the campus for some time. Saturday's concert receipts will be used to rent permanent facilities where a guy can sit down with a person and find out what the draft is all about. Meyer said the group's activities will not include aiding or advising young men who hope to escape military service by illegal means. The whole bit isn't draft resistance, he said. We will tell them that we can't counsel them to avoid the draft. If they want to leave the country, they will have to see an immigration service. It's much like tax counseling, purely informational. Meyer said several Oklahoma City lawyers and clergymen have offered their services to the group, said the organization plans to publish pamphlets with information about the draft and what the alternatives are. He said he did not know when the center will open. Saturday's concert had the approval of an OCU Student Senate Subcommittee on Student Affairs. So this is a great story, and I was excited because I'm an alum of OCU. I went to law school. My dad went there. My son is going there now. So this was a cool story. We also have stories talking about more of the controversy regarding the draft counseling centers. Another story from 1970 talks about draft counseling centers operating in Tulsa and Norman. We have another story from 72 talking about funding for a legal fair that included a draft counseling concept. Here in another story from 1972 talked about student government at OU was involved in draft counseling. And then finally, in 1980, I found a story that talked about with the beginnings again of draft registration, where the local Catholic Church was speaking about the possibility of doing draft counseling. So I shared these examples to say this is a little snapshot of what draft counseling looked like in one part of the country. I guarantee if you looked in every other city where we're represented today, there's going to be similar stories. And these were very ordinary people. These were not, most of them weren't lawyers. Most of them were ordinary people who got trained to help their fellow neighbor. And so that's what this training today is all about, is empowering you to be able to step up and do this work. So let's talk a little bit about what a draft counselor does. Well, first of all, a draft counselor is not a lawyer in most cases, which means draft counselors don't tell people what to do. They don't give advice. Rather, what draft counselors do is they give information so that people who are facing a draft can make the best choices possible. And they can doing so fully informed, understanding all of their options. And this is an important piece of it because draft counseling, when done best, operates under a function called non-directive counseling. And by the way, part of this, why non-directive counseling is so important. And by the way, I got this idea from the GI Rights Network, an organization that helps active duty and reservists who are facing these questions. Okay. So anyway, non-directive counseling, the idea is we don't tell people what to do. That's not what this is about. But rather, with non-directive counseling, it's about equipping people so they make up their own minds. And so this does a couple of good things. One, of course, is it keeps the draft counselor safe. You're not telling someone to ever break the law, ever. You don't do that. What you're doing is you're equipping someone with information. Secondly, what the other thing it does is it empowers the person being counseled. In other words, no one's telling them what to do. And think about when I think about when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. If someone told me to do something, did I want to do it? No. I'd be more likely to do the exact opposite just out of spite. And I wasn't alone. That's a pretty typical response for a young adult. And so I would argue when we talk about draft counseling, it's important we don't come into this with an agenda. We're going to tell people what to do. Rather, we're equipping them. We're equipping young people to make their best decisions. Another important element of draft counseling is that draft counselors are trained and that they know enough to be able to give good information, but they also, very importantly, are humble. That's critical because the most dangerous thing is a draft counselor who pretends they know more than they do, who says things without fully understanding the regulations and gets someone in trouble. That's a bad scenario. What's more important is for someone who is in this role, when they encounter a problem they don't know the answer to tell the person they're counseling, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to have to get back to you. Or I don't know the answer to that, but I bet it's in the regulations. Let's you and I together look it up and find out what the regulations say. The important thing is you have to be humble enough to say you don't know the answer, because I guarantee there will be times you will not know the answer. And what makes a good draft counselor is not that you have all the answers, but you know when you don't, and you know where to go to for help when you do. A few things I say about draft counselors. Good draft counselors are open-minded and non-judgmental. For many of us in this room and are watching online, we may be coming at this in the place of conscientious objection, of wanting to help people who are resisting war because of conscience. But not everyone's going to be in that place. There may be many other reasons and motivations for why they're seeking draft counseling. Good draft counselors are going to be there for wherever people are at and are not going to necessarily assume that because someone else is concerned about this and I don't care about that, that doesn't matter. Our job is to help them wherever they're at. Finally, good draft counselors follow ethical boundaries. And some of those include not breaking the law while in the role of a draft counselor. There's a place in life for civil disobedience and from a moral and ethical standpoint. I'm not saying that, but when you're wearing the hat of a draft counselor, that's not the space for this civil disobedience. We're operating in a legal arena. But because of that, we don't tell people to break the law. We can, however, give people the legal, ethical, and moral consequences of different courses of action. That's fine, but you're never telling people to break the law. We do our best to provide accurate information, and then we are ready to make referrals when necessary to professionals. So that would include when someone really needs a lawyer, make a referral to a lawyer. When someone needs a medical professional, we make a referral to a medical professional. In other words, we have to be ready to make those referrals and help people along the way. Now, in the work of draft counseling, and again, we're really reviving a concept that has been inactive for a while. So we're having to rethink some things. But one of them is thinking through what are the stages we might be going through in draft counseling. And I think really there's two big stages. The first stage is the one we are in right now. And I'm calling that the pre-draft stage. What I mean by the pre-draft stage is that we do not yet have a draft in place, but we have the apparatus, the machinery ready to make a draft happen. It could happen in the drop of a dime. Congress passes a law, president signs it, draft is underway. So we are in that pre-draft stage. We need to be ready. And so part of that is we really have three things to do in that. First of all is outreach. We need to just get this issue on the table for people. A lot of folks is not on their radar screen, hasn't been for a long time. Our job as draft counselors at this moment in this pre-draft stage is to get it on people's radar screen, number one. Number two, we need to do education. There's a lot of myths about how the draft works, mostly based on what the rules were in the Vietnam era. The rules have changed. The situation is different. So education is another piece of it. The third piece of it is preparation. That is assisting those who might be drafted to document their views, to document where they stand, and document all the evidence that might justify them getting an exemption from the draft. Now is the time to help them to prepare to document that. So that is the pre-draft stage. And there's a lot of work to be done in this pre-draft stage. And today's training will primarily be focusing on the pre-draft stage. But the second stage is what I'm going to call the active draft stage. And that is what we're going to have to do to pivot once a draft actually begins. In that scenario, one of the first and most critical things we'll be doing is the work of triage, which is determining how serious a risk of someone being drafted is, and then prioritizing those at most risk of being drafted so that they have the resources they need then to be ready. And really what triage is also assessing who it's frankly going to depend a lot on what someone's draft number is and all those other factors. But this triage approach will be very critical in this active draft stage. And then it's also going to be a matter of helping people to put forward the best cases possible. And then as draft counselors, being ready to advocate for them at the draft board hearing. One thing to bear in mind is if the trends look like they did during the Vietnam era, there will not be enough lawyers who will take these cases to go to draft board hearings. That's the reality, which means draft counselors will have to be honestly doing many of the roles that a lawyer would normally do, but in the draft board. And so in our next trainings coming up, our trainings 201 and 301, we're going to be dealing with a lot of those issues. How do we present a case at the draft board? So that's at that next level. But for now, for today, we're focusing primarily on the pre-draft stage. What do we do right now? So with all of that said, I think this is a good point to stop for a moment. And Jamie, do we have any questions?
Not in the chat.
Okay. So if anyone has anyone in the room have a question, if you want to raise your hand, holler at it. Yeah, Lance.
Has enlistment numbers dropped that precipitously?
So Lance asked, has enlistment numbers dropped precipitously? I don't know the latest stats on that. So I do know that different branches are having struggles to meet their numbers. At this moment, it does not look like there's a major shortage quite yet. It could be coming. It'll depend on what the administration does, but at this moment, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily based on numbers, which is the concern. It's more of will the administration do things that pull us in deeper, I guess.
When the Iraq war came, they had National Guard served. Was that because of the shortage?
Yeah, so we had a question in the room. Someone asked about during the Iraq war, when they called up the National Guard, was that due to a shortage? In a way, yes. I would say today the reservists and Guard are being called to do things active duty historically did not, so that were only done by active duty in the past. That's not the case today. And so also related to that, in talking about draft exemptions, a lot of people during the Vietnam era specifically enlisted in the National Guard to potentially avoid being deployed. That would not be a smart move today because the National Guard in some cases are more likely to be deployed, which is weird. So, okay, well, we will have more time for questions along the way. So in the meantime, if you have questions that come up, put them in the chat if you're watching on Zoom, but we will have some more time for questions later. But I think this is a great time now to hand it off to Ed to share a little bit about how the selective system works itself. And what draft registration might look like now and in the future, as well as some about the mechanics of the draft. So I want to hand this off to Ed.
Thank you, James, and thanks to all of you for taking time to learn more about something that's not on most people's radar. I'm not a lawyer, but I will start with a lawyerly qualification that everything I am going to say is going to be oversimplified and uncertain. The uncertainties coming from the fact that between now and when a draft is activated, the regulations could change, the law itself could change. We know that the draft boards which exist are undertrained and almost certain to act arbitrarily and unpredictably. And finally, unfortunately, that we have currently a lawless regime in Washington that cannot be counted on to comply with what is the law, and not everybody will be able to take their case to court. But with that said, currently the law requires all male as assigned at birth, U.S. citizens and residents to register with the Selective Service System within 30 days of their 18th birthday and report to the Selective Service System within 10 days each time they change their address until they reach their 26th birthday. Very few people do this. In 2023, for example, that had fallen to less than 40% of 18-year-olds registered with the Selective Service System at all. What actually happens is that in many states, including, as I understand it, Oklahoma, the Selective Service System has gotten state legislatures to pass laws making registration with the Selective Service System a requirement for men of draft age to get a driver's license. So there's a line in the fine print on the driver's license application, which most people don't read, which says, by applying for a driver's license, you're agreeing to have us send your information to the Selective Service System and register you. And the first time people realize that that has happened is if and when they get a letter from Selective Service confirming that they have been registered for a possible draft about which they know nothing, which might be in some circumstances when they seek draft counseling. But in other states, a minority of states, but including some very large ones, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Oregon, and the big kahuna where I live in San Francisco, California, there's no state law linking draft registration to driver's licenses or state jobs or state financial aid or anything like that. So there's very little reason for people to register, and almost nobody does. So to fill in those gaps, the Selective Service System buys lists from data brokers, and they send out several 100,000 threatening letters every year saying, we found this name and address on a list someplace, and we think it might correspond to somebody who's supposed to register for the draft, but we didn't find you on the registration list, so if you're supposed to register, do so or else. The or else is an empty threat. People have not even violated the law unless they can be proven to have done so knowingly and willfully, which means they'd have to deliver provable notice, which they don't. These aren't certified letters. Some people register. The threats seem intimidating. Some people don't. After sending out a couple rounds of threatening letters, the Selective Service is left still with 100,000 or more names and addresses, which until recently, they would each year ritualistically turn this list of 100,000 names over to the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute. Department of Justice hasn't investigated or prosecuted anybody since 1986, partly because they don't actually have any evidence of knowledge and willfulness against any of these people. So it would be a complicated process to develop a case. And a few years ago, the Department of Justice told the Selective Service System to stop wasting their time and not make these referrals at all. So for the last few years, nothing whatsoever has been done to the people who didn't respond to these threatening letters. But that does fill in some gaps. And then as far as the requirement for address updates, again, nobody essentially reports address changes to the Selective Service. Most people don't even know they're supposed to. Selective Service gets address updates from the Postal Service, but how many young people actually bother to file a address change notice with the Postal Service every time they go back and forth from home to college or whatever it is, or move? So they're left with a list which is incomplete and inaccurate, grossly so. Now that failure of the system, which has been the case for decades, has become increasingly apparent for a variety of reasons in recent years. And in December of last year, the Selective Service finally ended that requirement, which is an extraordinary victory for decades of nonviolent direct action by generations of young people opting out nonviolently, not complying, and bringing the requirement to an end. So as of this December, when that change in the law takes effect, young people will no longer be required to register with the Selective Service. Good. But instead, Selective Service is being given a second chance, and Selective Service will be required to try to identify, locate, and register all those subject to the draft automatically, which is a sort of misleading euphemism, which means that they will try to take other federal databases. They've been given authority to access census data, Social Security data, IRS data, whatever else they can find, to try to cobble together a list of everybody who might be supposed to be drafted.
Ed,
That will result in a list which is, for a variety of reasons, equally, although differently, inaccurate and incomplete. But in terms of its implications for young people, it isn't much of a change for people in states like Oklahoma, because in Oklahoma, registration for those who get a driver's license is effectively automatic already. There'll be a different quasi-automatic process, but it's still basically going to start where you get a letter saying you've been registered, like it or not. And the first major decision point will still be when an induction order is sent out, whether you respond, and if so, how you respond. The big change with automatic registration next year will be in states like California and the others where people haven't registered in decades, and their big brother didn't register, maybe their parents, their father didn't register, they've never heard of this thing, and all of a sudden they too, like as people in Oklahoma have been experiencing, instead of getting a threatening letter saying you have to register, they're going to get a letter saying you've been registered. Surprise. So what does that mean? They're going to have they have a list of people who, again, incomplete and inaccurate, particularly with respect to the addresses. So what will actually happen if they activate a draft based on this list? And again, a parenthetical note that Selective Service has contingency plans for two different types of draft. One is a sort of cannon fodder draft, a general draft, which is what most of this discussion will be about. They have a separate contingency plan for a draft of healthcare workers, men and women up to age 45. That's actually the more likely kind of draft, but they've released far fewer details about it. So we're not going to talk much about that, but realize that those are the people actually most at risk of being drafted. But if they activate a general draft, what they will do is they will hold a lottery by birthday, pick some dates, and send induction notices to people or to names on their list and addresses on their list who are born on that date. Now, the notice will be a notice ordering people to report for examination and induction. So if you pass the physical and you haven't claimed some deferment or exemption, you'll be put on a bus to boot camp the same day. The regulations require that the induction date can't be less than 10 days after the notice is issued. But if it's sent out by regular mail, which it probably will be, it might take a week to arrive on the West Coast. So people might get these notices if they get them at all, and many people won't. But if they get the notice at all, it might be only a couple of days before the induction date. You can't make a claim for deferment or exemption until you have received the notice, and you can't make your claim after you've received notice to report for induction. So you may have only a couple days window, if that, in order to make the claim, which is why prior preparation, if you plan to apply for a deferment exemption, is so important. But why? So that's some basic process. We'll talk. I think James will talk more about what happens as you pursue that. But I also want to talk about why some people choose not to comply at various stages with the Selective Service law, which is really two questions, I think. One is why people oppose the draft, and the other is why, if they oppose the draft for some of those reasons, some of them choose not to comply. And I think it's tempting for people who oppose the draft to assume that other people oppose it for what seem intuitively obvious reasons. But I think it's really important for counselors to listen and be sensitive to the counselee's motives, which may be quite different for yours. Having been working in coalitions on this issue for decades, I know that the draft is wrong and bad for so many reasons and offends so many people for very different reasons. So people come to this from very different places, which may shape their response and their choices. So without understanding their motives and goals, it's hard to counsel them effectively, much less non-directively, about those choices. So some people oppose a draft because they see it as an aspect of militarism, as planning and preparations for war, as enabling planning for larger and longer wars. It's part of their feelings about peace and war. Other people oppose a draft, and all of these can be commingled in the same person to different degrees. Other people oppose a draft because it is involuntary, because it is coercive, because it is authoritarian. And it's particularly important to realize that some of these people would not accept a draft regardless of whether it were civilian purposes, and are just as opposed, or at least are opposed, to coerced alternative service chosen by the government as to military service ordered by the government. A third major motive for opposing a draft is that it singles out young people to bear the brunt of a policy enacted mostly by older voters and politicians, that it is overtly ageist. And there's a long historical connection for good reasons between the anti-draft movement and the youth movement. Draft resistance has been central to youth liberation movements around the world. In fact, I came into the anti-draft movement primarily out of my activism for youth rights and youth liberation, and I still identify primarily as an older person, as someone trying to be an ally to young people in their struggle for youth liberation. And I hope that some of you will conceive your draft counseling, if you're older people, in that way. Although the most effective draft counseling has often been peer counseling by draft age people counseling their peers. And a final set of reasons for opposing the draft are reasons of personal conscience. There are people who feel that being drafted or submitting to a draft is wrong for reasons that may not be ideological. They may or may not be conceived of as matters of faith, but they simply feel like this is the wrong thing for me. Again, all of these can overlap, and all of them can lead people to choose not to comply. And it's important also to realize that whether or not to comply with the Selective Service Law is not a singular or binary choice. There are many choice points along the way with many alternatives, all of which involve judgments under uncertainty. And people can and do choose to opt out at different stages of the process. So why would people not comply? One reason is that they don't qualify for any deferment. It's more or less a foregone conclusion that if they go through the process, once they've gotten an induction notice, if they accept it, acknowledge it, go through the process, they're going to get drafted. There's no point pursuing it. Well, they may see there's no point pursuing a deferment they're not going to get, or it may be sufficiently uncertain whether they would qualify. And qualified people who are entitled to deferments are going to get denied. People are going to be assigned to alternative service that is, in their minds, war-related or otherwise unacceptable. So this is not an irrational kind of feeling. Other people may feel, this is a significant group, that non-compliance is a less risky option. And that may seem surprising because typically people think of breaking the law as risky and complying with the law as the safer course of action. Realize that someone is not breaking the Military Selective Service Act unless their violation of some order is provably knowing and willful. You may have heard ignorance of the law is no defense. That's not the case with the Selective Service Act. It has an explicit specific intent requirement. So it's no crime not to do anything at all until the government has given you provable notice, which would typically either be you've chosen to sign for a certified letter, which you don't have to sign for, and any defense lawyer would say, sign nothing, say nothing until you've talked to a lawyer. You are doing yourself no favor by signing a certified letter. Your parents are doing you no favor and, in fact, are deeply compromising your case if they sign for a certified letter for you. You are perfectly legally entitled and have broken no law to wait until they send the FBI to the door to order you to report for induction before you do so, because that's the only point at which they could prove that to court. And in my case, there was both the signatures on certified letters and an FBI agent's testimony to giving me another chance to register before that were introduced in court against me. So this is real stuff. But so you're not taking much risk in not complying up to a point. Whereas complying takes the risk that, again, even if you think you have a good claim, it might be denied, or that you might be assigned to alternative service that's unacceptable, or that you might get a completely arbitrary and unfair draft board. There's a lot of risk. And if you go further into the process and then refuse, you've probably already given the government evidence such that you're more likely to be prosecuted and more likely to be convicted. So the further you go before you resist, the worse you've made your case, which is getting ahead of ourselves into criminal defense, but it's important to understand these things in terms of the choices that people are making. A third reason people choose not to comply, which may be uh, important, is that it's likely to be more effective in keeping yourself out of the draft. Because the list is incomplete and inaccurate, when they send out induction notices, a very large number, probably a majority of people, won't show up. Many won't show up because they didn't get the notice. Others will not show up by choice. They'll have a flood of people who didn't show up, very few ways to, they'll have to pick at best a handful. And again, this is what happened with non-registrants in the 1980s. They did pick out a handful. They picked out the people who'd been public and vocal and whose public statements could be used to convict us. But it backfired because that only called attention to the fact that there was safety in silence and safety in numbers for the rest of us. The same thing is likely to happen with respect to induction orders. And so people may feel like pursuing a claim, even if you think you might have a claim for deferment exemption, might not keep you out of the draft. Not showing up, just waiting to see whether they actually send the FBI to your door, which they can only do in an infinitesimal percent of cases, may be more effective. A fourth reason, which is probably the most important and the most common for people who make a deliberate choice not to comply, is that they want to impede the war effort, impede the draft, prevent anybody from being drafted, and prevent the draft being used as a tool of war and not simply to opt themselves out. There's a long-standing line of argument, even by people who might qualify for CO status, even people who had qualified for CO status and then renounced that deferment because they realized that if they did alternative service as a CO, somebody else would be drafted in their place and the draft would go along unimpeded. They had more people than they needed and they'd find somebody else. Whereas non-compliance did much more to monkey wrench the system and did much more to achieve their anti-war goals than the personal opt-out of seeking CO status. Again, that may or may not be your choice, but recognize that that's an important thing to think about and engage with people. Are you just trying to keep yourself out, or are you trying to stop the draft, stop war, have some other impact? And finally, there are people who, regardless of whether they thought it was going to be effective, there have been people who felt that it wasn't moral or ethical and that their own conscience would not allow them to opt themselves out of the draft just because they were offered that option, because their beliefs fit the definition, the government's definition of a conscientious objector, while other people who had other kinds of anti-war or anti-authoritarian or anti-ageist beliefs didn't qualify for CO. And some people said, I can't ethically and in good conscience pursue that personal opt-out when I know that that's not offered to everybody, that they don't have that choice. So a wide range of those kinds of motives might bring people not to comply. I'll stop here. I'll be available for questions, and if there is time within this session, and I'm very much available if groups are interested in talking more about some of these particularly motivational and goal-related questions, in your own communities, your congregations, youth groups, whatever, as this issue moves forward. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So we have a different sound systems in the room going on. So I want to go and open up for questions from what Ed shared with us. So if there's any questions either in the room or on through the chat, Jamie.
Yeah, there was a question. There was a question from the room that just said, to receive student loans, are you still required to register with Selective Service?
Ed, you want to take that?
Yes, but I can't hear the questions. You'll need to repeat them.
Oh, I'm sorry. So someone asked, is it still the rule that someone is denied access to student aid if they have not registered for the Selective Service?
The good news is that that is no longer the rule for federal student aid. I don't know the situation in Oklahoma. Some states have other state rules related to state student aid. Some states even won't let you register at a state university unless you've registered for selective service. I don't know the situation in Oklahoma, but I will say parenthetically, if people want to do something, in the pendency in this pre-draft stage, as James pointed out, a very good, valuable, potential thing that you could do is try and get your state laws penalizing non-registrants for the draft repealed, because even when we switch to automatic registration, those laws will continue to penalize previous non-registrants into the future. So that's something to work on at the state legislative level. But I don't know the details of Oklahoma law, unfortunately.
Thank you. But the good news here is that federal financial aid, which is for most students the biggest source of financial aid dollars for college, is not stopped if you have not registered for the draft. So that's one bit of good news here. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
What agency would it be from?
So Ed, someone in the room asked for the certified letters that are coming, where would they be coming from so folks can recognize them and know not to sign for them?
Well, we don't know how they will proceed. My guess, because certified letters are tedious and expensive, they'll probably send out an initial, just like general postal letter. These people can and should disregard, although you may want to go to a draft counselor if one shows up, because they'll be mixed up with a lot of spam and phishing and fake notices that are designed to look like they're from the selective service system. An actual induction order would come from the selective service system. But again, I think probably they'll send out a round of, again, this is guessing, but they'll probably send out a round of regular letters, and then if you don't answer them, you'll get, they'll go through a couple rounds of those, and then maybe pick out some subset to actually send certified letters, which is the point at which, but again, you don't have to sign for a certified letter. There's no requirement for that, and you're not helping yourself from a legal position by doing so. But they would come from the selective service system. We've seen when there have been draft scares in recent years, there's been floods of fake phishing messages. So particularly if people get email or text messages, even the selective service system says those are fake and you should disregard them. But that gives people all the more reason not to believe until the FBI shows up at their door that this is for real.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Question. If a young person has already signed up for selective service to get college loans and do those kinds of things, are they able to still make a case as a CO later?
Yes. We had a question in the room that just repeating it for the Zoom folks. What if someone has already registered for the draft? Are they registered with the selective service? Are they blocked from later seeking an exemption on the grounds of CO? And the answer is no. Registration does not stop you. So if someone chooses to register now, and then we'll talk more in a moment about the things we can do now to prepare to have as strong of a case as possible. But the fact whether you've registered or not, you still will have the opportunity to present to either claim CO status or to claim an exemption on some other status. Jamie.
So I've worked in schools, high schools, and I see a lot of recruiters present, and I'm just curious if there's any sort of practice. I know Ed might not know, but you might know in the high schools of kind of encouraging students, especially males assigned at birth, to register for selective service. Is that a practice?
So we had a question in the room ask: is it a practice in high schools to encourage young people, young males assigned at birth to register with the selective service? And I don't know if it's common. I know in my high school it was. I think there was a strong encouragement of that. But again, it's all moving. As of December, they're moving in this other model. So that's going to be changing as well. I will throw this out here. One of the more extreme things I've seen, I have seen military recruiters take advantage of young people I worked with one person years ago who was told by a recruiter that they were going to be drafted unless they enlisted with the military. And the kid actually was scared, called his mom. His mom said, well, if you got to do it, you got to do it. Thankfully, someone got them in touch with me. And I said, hell no, there's not a draft yet. And no, and the recruiter was just lying. The recruiter was trying to take advantage of someone who English was a second language, and they were just vile. So we can fully expect that. Recruiters will use every dirty book in the world, and every dirty trick in the book to try to get people to enlist, and they will use the fear of a potential draft as a tool for that. And again, I would just as a reminder, in the old days, it was often seen as a good strategy to enlist the National Guard to avoid deployment. That is not good advice today. In many cases, the Guard is even more likely to be deployed than active duty. So just to bear in mind, and as we have more conversation happening about the draft, we can expect the recruiters to take advantage of that, to try to use that actually as a tool for recruitment here at JMF. So.
I understand what you said correctly, that when you get your driver's license in Oklahoma, you're agreeing to be
Yes. So
registered for the draft?
So we had a question in the room asking about if someone has got their Oklahoma driver's license, have they consented to register for the draft? In Oklahoma, what it says is if you are male and you are over 16, if you are between the ages of 16 and 26, if you sign up to get your driver's license, at that point you are automatically registered. The state of Oklahoma sends your information to the Selective Service. You cannot. Now, I will tell you one thing that a loved one of mine did, which was before they turned 16, they went and got their driving permit before they turned 16. And this person is not getting their driver's license, will not be until they move out of state, most likely for this reason. So that's one loophole. Oklahoma law specifically says age 16 is the marker for sending the information. And so now, I have heard people have said that this may not work, that the state may send your information anyway, even if you got your driving permit at age 15 and a half, they still may send it on anyway. If I find out they have, they may be getting a lawsuit. but yeah, theoretically, if you're female, they're not sending your information. So.
And is there, like, just, I mean, no one has a crystal ball, but like, is there thought that like females would be ever included in the draft?
There's a possibility of that for sure. But sorry, for those of you watching on Zoom, we had someone ask in the room whether there's a danger of women being drafted in the near future. In the near future, no, for two reasons. One is the Supreme Court declined to take up a case that was challenging the drafting of men only. The logic to me of the case was bad, and I think a future court may see it differently, but right now the Supreme Court refused to take up the case, so they let it stand. Also, the current administration, in particular, also Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, is very hostile towards women serving in combat. So I think the odds of women being drafted in the short term are low. For cannon fodder, I should add, I think the odds of women being drafted in a special skills medical draft is quite high. I think that they will. I think they'll have no problems drafting women for that purpose. Jamie, and then after that, we're going to have to move on.
Yeah, this one is coming from the chat. It says, there's a ton of info. Is there a good pamphlet or book?
Well, there will be. I will mention that in the aftermath of this training, we have a lot of resources that we've been gathering and putting together, and those will be online hopefully in about a week at draftcounseling.org. I'm working on that, putting that together. There are some good resources we'll be sharing along the way. I'll be putting those in the chat for those of you watching on Zoom, and we'll be sending out an email afterwards with some more resources. But yes, there will be a lot more resources coming. And also, for those of you on Zoom, Ed put in a link in the chat. It's really helpful. So we're going to go ahead and move on now. We will have some more time for questions along the way, but we got a lot to cover today. So, so earlier we talked about who potentially is at most who could be drafted. And currently, the people at most danger of being drafted are males assigned at birth. And I would say my recommendation of thinking about this would be, I would say ages 15 to 26. The reason I'm saying that age 18 to 26 under the current law is who would be most likely to be drafted. Bear in mind, the draft is kicked off by congressional action. And when Congress kicks it off through congressional action, they can also change the rules when they do that. That's always a danger. So no one is really off the hook. But right now, current status is 18 to 26. My argument is thinking about 15 to 26 is we're thinking about 3 more years of the current administration. And so anyone who's turning 18, particularly males, over the next 3 years, I think is also pretty vulnerable. So my recommendation is focusing on ages 15 to 26. The other community are healthcare workers of any age or gender, but especially people who are able-bodied and healthy. Those are the people that they would potentially draft in a special skills draft. So for those people, thinking about those vulnerable population, those likely to be drafted, the next question we need to look at is what are the exemptions that would be in place if a draft was called? Now, when we discuss these exemptions, these are all found in the Code of Federal Regulations. In fact, to give you the citation, it's Title 32, Chapter 16 of the CFR. And I am going to put a link in the chat to this because this is extremely important. This is the actual regulations that they use to implement the draft. And so we're going to be actually doing some with this regulation. So for that, I'm going to share a screen. And let's make sure everyone in the room can, yes, okay, there we go. So everyone in the room can see it, and then y'all can see it in Zoom too. So this is the section, title, Chapter 16, Selective Service System. And so this has, these regulations here break down the whole system, how it functions, but particularly the exemptions. And so what we're gonna be looking at specifically right now is Part 1630. Classification rules. And so I will mention in looking through these different classifications, some of these are pretty obscure, some of them are very common. I'm going to focus today for this training on the 4 that I think are most common, they're most likely that people would apply for in these vulnerable populations we just discussed. Those 4 categories are people who are not acceptable to the military. Category 4F, that's going to be the biggest category by far. And we'll talk more about why it's a good thing to be categorized 4F if you can. The second category is going to be disability hardship exemptions. That is someone in your close family member that depends upon the person being drafted. Those fall under category 3A. Then we have conscientious objection. And those fall into 2 categories. 1-0, meaning those who are opposed to all forms of war, who will not participate as a non-combatant, but will do alternative service in lieu of that. And by the way, those of you who are here in person at 3:30, by the way, if you want to hear from someone who went through this process, Ralph Ediger, member of Joy Mennonite Church, is speaking at 3:30 for the afternoon service at Joy. So if you want to hear from him about his experiences as a conscientious objector who did alternative service, who lived in this very house right now where we're standing when he did his alternative service, hear from him at 3:30. But anyway, that's a 1-0 CO. However, another category of CO is a 1A0 CO, and that is someone who is conscientiously opposed to direct participation in war, but would be able, through their conscience, to do non-combatant duties, such as being a medic, such as being a supply clerk, such as doing something else, but not carrying a gun. People in that category are 1A0. Finally, the last exemption that I think might be a common one, especially in places like Oklahoma, are ministers and ministers in training. That's category 4D and 2D. And so we're going to talk about these in more detail in just a moment, but those are the 4 we're going to be focusing on. Now, you'll notice when I gave you that list, you'll notice I didn't mention some other common exemptions you might be thinking about, such as education. That's because that is no longer an exemption to the draft. It is only a deferment. So what do I mean by that? For the deferment, high school students, they get to finish high school or hit age 20. When they hit 20, if they don't have a high school diploma, too bad, they're getting drafted. But so again, that's one strategy. Delay high school as long as possible, get to age 20. College students get to finish their current semester. They get the draft notice, or if they're a senior, they get or their last. I guess it actually says their last year of college. So their last year of college. So they could be in grad school, I guess theoretically, be in their last year of college, but they're allowed to finish the current year. After that, they're draftable. So that's a deferment. It only buys you a little time. It's not an exemption. What about some of the other ones? You often hear people say, oh, I'm the last surviving male of my side of the family name. No, that's not really an exemption anymore. There are some exemptions that kick in the combat text of war. If your sibling has died in combat, then you might be exempted. I'm not going to go into that because that's such an obscure one that doesn't happen too often unless we get into a much bigger war than we're expecting to in the near future. So primarily for the purposes of this, deferments are helpful. They buy you some time, but we're really focusing on is exemptions. So for these different exemptions, these are found here in this regular, we're looking at the classification rules. So here, for instance, for one, actually, I'll mention like this also, these classifications also mention, for instance, 1A means available for unrestricted military service. So that means you're getting drafted. But you scroll down, and again, there's a lot here. We're not going to go through some of these because they're pretty obscure. 1C, for instance, includes people who are already in the military or are working for a NOAA or the Public Health Service, for instance, are exempt. So anyway, this whole thing goes into detail, but the important ones for us, we'll scroll down to, for instance, here's class 4D, Minister of Religion. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Anyway, it's all found in this regulation. Looking at the time, though, I think this is a good stopping point for a comfort break. So we're going to take a break for, let's say for about 8 minutes. So we'll start back at 2:05 p.m. So if you have any questions in the meantime, put them in the chat or hand them to Jamie if you're in the room, and we will see you back at 2:05.
There's a
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started again. I will mention that we had in the chat, I'll read one question real quick, and Ed gave an answer in the chat because we're going to read this. It's kind of important. Have any state mandatory registration of driver's license laws been repealed? Ed said, no, but some states have repealed state laws that previously made selective service registration a prerequisite for state college aid. Also, the Federal Selective Service Repeal Act would preempt all of these state laws and bar future state penalties for past registration. And so that is an attempt that's right now that's continue to be pushed in Congress to try to repeal the selective service system altogether. So, and again, if you want to get involved in that effort, Ed's really the go-to person on that. So, okay, well, continuing onward. I think for now, let's talk through a little bit about, we earlier remembered I talked about the idea of there being 2 stages of draft counseling work, a pre-draft stage and an active draft stage. And now thinking about this pre-draft stage, what are the main areas of our work right now? Well, the first piece of that is going to be outreach and education. And that simply means getting the issue of military conscription into discussion and awareness. And then following that up with education that's targeted on those who are most affected. And that's going to be, again, young men and medical professionals about what a draft might look like and what are the opportunities available for exemption and delay, as well as what are the opportunities. And I didn't talk about this as much. Ed rarely brought up some good points as far as just the issue of how you're being notified that you're being drafted and the issues of what's necessary for the government to actually force you to being drafted. For instance, actually being served. So those are all pertinent issues for folks to be aware of. Now we think about where outreach and education can happen. That can happen in a lot of different ways at a lot of different places. That can include, and I think first and foremost, particularly here in Oklahoma, religious communities are going to be a big piece of this. It's critical that youth groups start talking about the draft, start talking about what do young people believe about the draft. And again, I think for a lot of people, even in traditional peace churches, I've discovered talking to young people that a fair number of them, young people, sometimes, again, even in peace churches or in liberal churches of all kinds, they may not really know why their family believes what they believe. They may not know why that they don't go to war. And so we need to start having those conversations now. We shouldn't just assume that our kids know what we believe because they may not. But also thinking another area that would be an incredible place of outreach is in the educational setting. In the K to 12 settings, it's tricky. We have some public school teachers in the room today, and I know it's challenging with all the other things you have going on in the classroom to bring up something like this. My suggestion, though, is one of the little things you can do is simply to be a voice saying there are options, and that if a young person has questions, there are places they can reach out to for help. Having just initiating those conversations and just letting folks know in your school, if you have questions, hey, come talk to me. I'm there for you, to make a big difference. In the college environment, I think it's also incredibly important. And bear in mind, one of the areas that military recruiters these days are very present are college campuses. And the reason is that they are looking for the kids who are struggling academically. Absolutely. Time and time again. I've seen this over and over again. They look for the kids struggling academically and they tell them, hey, college may not be for you, but we got an opportunity for you. In the same, so knowing that that community, that age range is very vulnerable to begin with, we can also expect if a draft is called, that community is going to be targeted. So that's why education outreach needs to be happening there. In career techs, Oklahoma, we have a tremendous career tech program of higher education that's vocationally focused. That's another place where we need to be engaged in outreach and education on these issues. Would also argue community organizations, personal relationships you have with people. Another big area is going to be online, especially social media. We really need some folks that are younger than me and a lot of the other folks in this room, frankly, to start putting together short form videos for TikTok and for all of the others. We really need to just be raising the awareness. And I'm very concerned right now that while there are people talking about these issues, it's not near enough. The risk to me is much, much higher, but our awareness is still relatively low. So in this pre-draft stage, this is one critical area that trained folks can be involved in, is helping folks just know what this system is, what it could be doing, what it may be doing in the future, and to be having those conversations. Now, that's the first piece of the pre-draft stage. The other piece is really important, and it is preparation. And this is really the heart of draft counseling work, because it means working with people who may be targeted by a draft to find evidence that backs a claim for claims for an exemption, and then finding ways to document that. Now, considering what we talked about earlier, the importance of a non-directive approach, part of what's often involved in this is helping a young person or again, a medical professional as well, helping them to explore what all the possibilities are. And so for myself, if I was engaged in this work, I would begin by first getting to know the person you're counseling, learning from them about their life story, what's brought them to this point in time, what their educational experiences have been like, what their family dynamics are like, but also to probe into questions about physical health issues, mental health issues, sports injuries. That's a huge one. Sports injuries, we'll come back to in a little bit. Whether they've ever been prescribed any kind of psychiatric medications, whether they've ever been hospitalized, whether they've ever been to a counselor. All of these things are relevant questions that could help to make the case for draft exemption. And then once we have that understanding, then we can start one with the young person. Once they understand which exemptions they are going to seek to document, then we start looking for good evidence. Now, what could that evidence be? Well, here's the beautiful thing about evidence. It can be almost anything that is relevant and credible that helps to make the case. So a few examples of common forms of documentation. Medical records, huge. Certainly for the person being drafted, but also medical records can be quite helpful in the case of a hardship dependency case. Let's say that the person facing a draft is taking care of an elderly mother who's in bad health. We need the medical records of the mom. That would be an example. Another example would be school records, particularly if you're lucky and there's misconduct. This is one of the few times in life where having that bad permanent record is a good thing, because there's a lot of things that the military would say, oh, that would make you not fitting to join the military. We're looking for everything. Also, criminal records, juvenile justice records potentially could be relevant to explaining why someone should be getting that 4F exemption. Also, another area are school assignments and writings. I've seen some really good CO cases that focused on, often part of the evidence was this essay the person wrote, maybe in a college assignment, where they explored some issue. That could be a very relevant. Also, photographs. One of my favorite things myself is with my son, when I because he's 19, when we go to peace protests together, I always take pictures, always. And I take pictures of as many other young people as possible. And I do that as that provides evidence later to show that this kid was motivated enough at age 19 to show up at a peace protest, long before the draft was called. That helps to show credibility. Also, another area of evidence are written statements. That can be from family members, friends, teachers, religious leaders, etc. That's good evidence. Also, press clippings. In particular, I would throw this out here. Letters to the editor are golden. Why? Letters to the editor are more likely to be published than they used to be. In the old days, and I still write a lot of letters to the editor, but in the old days, you had to send in 5 or 6 and maybe you'd get one published. Now, it's more like 1 out of every 2 of mine get published. It's much easier to get published. The beauty of a young person writing a letter to the editor about an issue they care about is you now have something dated. A newspaper, physical copy, that's gold. So letters to the editor is another, and also press clippings. If your young person has been doing something that shows that their devotion to peace and justice issues, that's good evidence. So anyway, that's in the general sense. Let's talk about in the more specific case, though, how this plays out. And so for that, we're going to go back and look at the regulations, the CFRs. So let's share screen for that. And so let's look at the first one. We're going to look at 4F. And 4F is a huge one because a lot of people, I've seen estimates in the media of saying that possibly as much as 60 to 70% of US young people would not qualify for military service today if they tried enlisting. So this 4F is where it's at. So let's read this together. It says, Class 4F, registrant not acceptable for military service. In Class 4F shall be placed any registrant who is found by the Secretary of Defense under applicable physical, mental, or administrative standards to be not acceptable for service in the armed forces, except that no such registrant whose further examination or re-examination is determined by the Secretary of Defense to be justified shall be placed in Class 4F until such further examination has been accomplished and such registrant continues to be found not acceptable for military service. Now, that's a very vague standard. What it's basically saying is that the military has its own regulations that say who can come in and who cannot. And so if someone would not meet those regulations, then they are Class 4F. So where do we find those regulations? Well, a whole bunch of sources, but I'm going to focus today on the physical and mental health side of it, which is in Department of Defense instruction, or I guess I should say now Department of War instruction, 6130.03 volume 1. And I have it here on the screen here. And by the way, I'll put links in the chat to both of these documents. But this says medical standards for military service, appointment, enlistment, or induction. So this basically says what are the medical criteria, medical conditions that if you have these conditions, you can't serve. So here's the nice thing about this. There's a feature, most browsers or PDF readers you hit Control F, you can search in the document. So I'm going to plug in Crohn's. Okay, excellent. So CROHN. So for instance, here it's a disqualifying condition. History of inflammatory bowel disease, including but not limited to Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, ulcerative bronchitis, or indeterminate colitis. It's on the list. So you got that diagnosis, you're exempt. Let's check for autism. Yes, autism spectrum disorders. That's by the way, some of these categories, especially neurodevelopmental disabilities, are really, really broad and really, really subjective. Bear in mind, I'm not telling anyone to commit fraud or to say something is not there, but often a medical provider has a choice of which diagnosis is appropriate. A good draft counselor knows what things are on this list and can help a young person to say, you need to talk to your doctor and see if they'll say it's this. Not telling them to lie, absolutely not. But we are saying is if a doctor has some discretion of which they go with. Let's go with the thing that's on this list. But there's a long, I'll plug in, let's check asthma. Asthma, it says, history of airway hyperresponsiveness, including asthma, reactive airway disease, exercise-induced bronchospasm, or asthmatic bronchitis after the 13th birthday. And then they have some qualifiers here. So this is, asthma is an example of one where that there are qualifiers, such as the condition had to develop at a certain time. There's others that may have, so let's, for instance, let's look at, actually, let's do that. Now that one, I don't know what the medical term is for, because flat feet in itself doesn't say, but you know what we could look for instead? Let's see if I find feet. Sometimes you have to know the medical term, but let's look up what one of the ones I think might be really interesting for us is, let me go back to the table of contents. So under, okay, learning psychiatric and behavioral disorders is page 50. Let's jump there.
Yeah, right.
So for instance, here's for ADD, it says, would be disqualifying, says if a recommended or prescribed IEP program 504 plan of work accommodations after the 14th birthday, history of comorbid mental disorders, meaning that you have ADD, even if you had it as a child, but you also have other medical issues. Also says prescribed medication in the previous 24 months, which means some folks who might be thinking about getting medicated, they may want to consider it if their doctor agrees with them, or documentation of adverse academic occupational work performance. Jamie.
Might be out of the scope of what we're talking about here, because we're, focusing on people who are wanting to, in some way, not serve in the military. But for those who are wanting to, like we were talking in the break, but a recruiter is actively giving them, sense that they're very eligible when they have all these conditions. What kind of accompaniment, would you suggest that a person provide if they have a relationship of trust with that young person?
So the question we had in the room is that looking at these criteria from the reverse side, that a young person really wants to join the military, but we are aware of them having issues that might be red flags here, and that they know that recruiters might be encouraging the potential recruit to conceal things. Well, the number one thing I would tell a young person in this category would be to say that if you conceal things when you go into the military, if you hide things and you later have medical problems because of that, you potentially could be criminally prosecuted for fraudulent enlistment. Are you likely to be? No. I'll be honest with you. But is it possible? Yes. What's more likely is you'll be kicked out of the military, but be given a discharge under what's called other designated physical and medical disorders, which means it's a pre-existing condition. Military is not paying it. You're kicked out. You might have an okay discharge, maybe if you're lucky, but you're not going to get medical benefits. So my argument would be if a young person really wants to join the military, they should follow the letter of the law and be completely honest when they go to MEPS about all of the medical conditions. And they should bring their medical records with them. The regulations say they're supposed to do that. Recruiters don't tell young people to do that, but they need to. Because if they're not qualified to serve, they're going to have, as an attorney, I can tell you story after story about people who were told to lie by the recruiters, and then they had medical issues later and big problems later. And they were screwed because they concealed stuff, they lied. And it's upsetting to me because these young people they wouldn't have thought to do this on their own. The recruiter put them up to it. Sometimes the recruiter coaches them very specifically on how to lie. One of the common ones I always hear that a lot of my clients tell me is they're told by the recruiters, when you get asked the medical questions, no means go. Yes means your enlistment stops. So you check no on all the boxes, no matter what. You just check no. No means go. That's vile. Setting these young people up for bad situations is frankly fraud against the U.S. government for the recruiter's part, but it does happen all the time.
James, can I ask one real quick question?
Sure.
So this was something that came up after XF became the Secretary of Defense or War. I don't know if they took action on it. They were talking about barring transgender individuals from serving, so I assume they would also have an exemption, maybe non-binary people.
Yes. So we had a question in the room asking about what about transgender people, how and non-binary people under these regulations. Well, this is, I would argue, under the current rules as it stands now, and I'll begin this by saying this is I'm on both sides of this argument because I have clients who are transgender clients in the military who are fighting to stay in. So that's a complicating factor for me for a lot of reasons. But for the concept of draft, yes, under the current rules, the military has said gender dysphoria is a disqualifying. In fact, I'm just going to, don't know if they put it in this reg yet. Let's see if they have. Yes. So they currently have in the regulation treatment for gender dysphoria or in pursuit of a sex transition is listed. So I do, so at the present moment, someone who is transgender would be disqualified under the current rules. I think another question is what about someone who has not done any kind of physical transition but has socially transitioned or who is choosing to present their gender in a way that would be non-binary? That's an open question of how that would play out.
Maybe getting a therapist's diagnosis.
Yes. And specifically, if you had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria under the current rules, that would be disqualifying. So anyway, this regular, in fact, I'm going to put these in the chat real quick just so that we can have these. So this DODI, Department of Defense instruction, let's do that real quick just so that y'all have that. Actually, I can't do that while this is open, so we'll come back to that a little bit. So anyway, though, so for the other things I'll mention, though, on the issue of this unsuitable, going back to class 4F, bear in mind, it's not just physical and mental issues. It's going to be anything else that would be an issue that keep you from enlisting. Criminal convictions would be a significant one. Any kind of criminal entanglements potentially be disqualifying. Another one is drug use. One of the more interesting ones, I think, is normally I'd be nervous to tell someone, oh, you should tell them when you go to the MEPS that you use cocaine or something, because then you're admitting to a crime. But what if you say, hey, I got my Oklahoma medical marijuana card. I smoke every day to treat my depression and anxiety. I think that would qualify you under 4F. So I'm not telling people to go get the medical marijuana cards, but what I am saying is that if you're in a jurisdiction where it is legal to consume and you are consuming, you should be honest about that fact. And that would be a disqualifying factor under the current rules. So some interesting possibilities. Another thing to always look for are sports injuries. A lot of recruiters tell kids to conceal sports injuries, but a lot of people have them. And sports injuries, even once, and the thing is deceptive about sports injuries is often you may have someone who is in great physical shape, but because they've had past sports injuries, when you're carrying a 40-pound rucksack and you're marching 10 miles and this, that, and the other, before long, you have stress fractures. Before you have all kinds of other issues. If those things can be documented, those are grounds for an exemption. Again, the sports injuries, I think, is a huge one just because I've seen it on the other side from active duty people who did hide that when they went in and later had problems. So if it can be a grounds for discharge, it's also potentially a disqualifying factor for service. The key is documentation. And that's where as in this pre-draft stage, what we can be encouraging young people to do now and to work with their parents on doing is to get those medical records, get them saved so you have them when you need them. So that was, a few other things I'll mention, a few other things we should mention, we're going on about possible other areas of documentation. School records, especially IEP records. That's individualized educational plan for special education students. Those can be a huge source of evidence. And again, that is several of the criteria listed under the DoD regs show that certain learning disabilities are disqualifying conditions. And again, having that evidence from an outside person, in this case, your school district, is golden. So there's a lot of possibilities here, but we're going to have, because we're running short of time, we're going to have to keep trucking on. So let's look next at the dependent hardship discharge. And so for this one, let's see here. This is under part 1642 of the regs. And so so the key things here is that it says the term dependent shall apply to the wife, child, parent, grandparent, brother, or sister of a registrant, It also goes on to say the term child includes an unborn child, stepchild, foster child, or legally adopted child who is legitimate or illegitimate, but shall not include any person 18 years or older unless he or she is physically or mentally handicapped. Goes into some more detail about what this means, but in short, for a hardship dependency discharge, you need to show that the person who is being drafted is critically needed to take care of this person. I will tell you from the military side of things, the cases that involve actual physically meeting a need, such as being a caregiver, are the ones most likely to be granted. Financial concerns are often not taken as seriously. I would still argue that they can be, and the regulations make it clear that that financial grounds are grounds for getting the hardship dependency. Basically, though, to prove the hardship dependency, first of all, you need documentation showing the need is there. So, for instance, if it's because someone is disabled, then it might be medical records from the dependent. It might be letters to members of the community, maybe from a church or religious community saying, hey, we know how much that Bob helps his mom, how involved he is in her life, that she wouldn't be able to make it to her medical appointments if she didn't have her son to take her there. That would be a good letter. We also are looking for letters from all family members within about a 100-mile radius of the person who is the dependent. So basically, we need all of the other family members in the area to say, I can't pick up the slack. I'm so glad that my nephew Bob can do this, but I sure can't take this on. Those letters to be helpful. Also, if you're claiming the finances as the reason for the hardship, then financial records, a household budget, things like that will be useful. So now let's talk, the next exemption let's talk about conscientious objection. And that is on part 1636. The key for this is, let's look at, let's read through both the 1AO and the 10. We'll do the 10 first. It says, a registrant must be conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form and conscientiously opposed to participation in both combatant and non-combatant training and service in the armed forces. In other words, this is a person who can't serve in the military at all without violating the conscience. B, a registrant's objection may be founded on religious training and belief. It may be based on strictly religious beliefs or on personal beliefs that are purely ethical or moral in source or content, and occupy in the life of a registrant a place parallel to that filled by belief in a supreme being for those holding more traditionally religious views. And C, a registrant's objection must be sincere. So to say it another way, what this says is you must be opposed to all wars. You can't be a selective objector, which is a real problem because a lot of people, if you ask a lot of good people, would say, I wouldn't fight in Vietnam. I wouldn't fight in Iraq. I would fight in World War II against the Nazis. There's some sound logic there for a lot of people of using just war principles to say there are some wars that are extreme that'd be worth fighting. This war isn't. Unfortunately, U.S. law does not recognize selective conscientious objection. So one has to show you're opposed to all war. Your objection must be primarily based on religion or religious-like beliefs. And I say religious-like beliefs because your beliefs have to function in the same way as a religious person's does. But it can be done. I can tell you in the active duty side of things, I've worked with quite a few secular clients, people who are atheists and agnostics or free thinkers of all kinds, who have secured conscientious objector status. So it can be done. But you have to show that these beliefs function in a similar way. I do remember one of the key cases on this that established this right was a case from back in the Vietnam era, where a guy who was being drafted told his draft board, I don't believe in God, I'm not religious, but I believe in beauty. That's my overriding universal principle. Anything is beautiful, that's what I seek. War is ugly, that's why I don't do it. In the end, the draft board said no, but the court said yes. The court said the government can't make a call into saying that's not religious. If this guy says that's religion for him, it's religion, it has to be accepted. That's the good news. Finally, the objection has to be sincere. Now, here's what gets complicated. Most people do not object to a war for just one reason. For instance, you might object to the war because of a generalized objection to all wars, but you also might object to the war because you think that the commander-in-chief is a terrible person leading you into a terrible situation. You might have political objections to wars. I had one client years ago that told me, James, I would fight in the war for the oppressed. I won't fight in the war for the rich. Lots of reasons people have beliefs about war. And you can have other beliefs parallel based on political reasons, pragmatic reasons. That's fine. But the primary reason has to be religion or something adjacent to religion. So that's awfully subjective and frustrating. That's what we're dealing with. Now, the difference, 1-0 we have in front of us deals with objection to participation in war altogether. The difference of 1A0 is a little different. Here, it says a registrant must be conscientiously opposed to participation in combatant training and service in the armed forces. And so if someone says, I could fight in war, but I could serve in the military, but I can't fight. I can't carry a gun. It's specifically killing is the issue. Then that person would be a 1A0 objector. So how can we document a conscientious objection beliefs? Well, one of the best ways, and I'm going to share a screen again for this one, because there's a really helpful workbook that the Center for Conscience and Wars put out. Let me see if I can find that real quick. My Zoom thing keeps putting the thing. Okay, here we go. And we'll put this, I'll link to this in a little bit in the chat as well. But from Center of Conscience War, registration and basic draft information, this little booklet. And so they give some information about the draft more generally, but what I really like is at the very end. It talks about what do I believe about war? It has questions for conscientious objectors to consider. And then at the very end, they have a section that's worksheet. And so for this, it has these essay questions. And these essay questions are really modeled after the questions that you would be asked at the draft board. And so they are, question 1, describe the beliefs which are the basis for your claim as a conscientious objector. If appropriate, state whether these beliefs would permit you to serve in a non-combatant position in the armed forces or pay taxes for war. So a young person could write these responses. And I would also throw out there, a lot of people are not going to be, may not be writers, but they can still talk. And so audio recordings, video recordings is completely fine and even might be preferable in some ways. But if we can get a young person to put down what they actually believe now, long before the draft is called, that's going to have tremendous credibility in ways that something done after a draft is called will not have as much credibility. And so these questions are a great starting point. And then what was recommended for the Center of Conscience and War says is that after you write these questions, you sign it, then you can send this to them. But I'm hoping in time we will have a registry here at Joy Mennonite that you can send these to as well. But the idea is that you've not only prepared these things, you have them in your own personal file, but you've now the young person has filed these with several different organizations who have them on file as well. The importance of that is that when an organization has it on file, you now have someone else who can testify at the draft board hearing, who can say, yes, we received this statement from John Doe on such and such date. We've had it on file, and that's something else. It shows credibility. It shows how seriously someone is taking this process.
I think I did that with War Resisters League when I had to register with selective service.
Yes. So absolutely. Other things that we can also put in this packet, if you're planning for how do you document conscientious objection, would also include supporting letters from families, friends, teachers, clergy, etc. And they do have, by the way, this guide from the Center for Conscience War has some guidance on what those letters can look like. I would say some of the best letters, by the way, are if you have maybe your grandpa or an uncle who served in the military. Veterans actually write excellent letters, because I've had veterans have said, my grandson, I don't agree with him at all, but boy, I would, I know this, if I was in the military now, I wouldn't want to be in the trenches with him because he wouldn't pull the trigger. That's a great letter.
Yeah.
That's a great letter because from a military standpoint, for someone to say, I don't trust he can do the job. That's a good letter. So again, think in unexpected ways, but how you can prove it up. Also, as we talked about earlier, things like photographs are helpful, press clippings. And the big reason for this is when you're looking at conscientious objection, you're needing to prove sincerity. How do you prove sincerity? You prove it by showing that someone's lifestyle, their beliefs are reflected in their lifestyle. And so if you can show that this person goes to peace protests all the time, they write to their congressman, they do this, they do that. Or even me, I've had people say, because I believe in peace, I choose to be a vegetarian. Great. Write about that. Write about your choice of vegetarianism and how that's a part of your ethical guidance. Whatever your choices are, I've had some people say, I don't play violent video games because they feel too much like, fine, that's great. Write about that. Document why you don't do these things. But again, those lifestyle type of things can be very, very helpful. Also consider relevant school assignments. A lot of teachers love giving their students questions like, if there was a draft, what would you do? Great, save that school assignment. And again, there's a date on it. That's really helpful. Finally, one thing I would really suggest for any young person who really wants to seriously pursue this is to build a resume of their activism, to write down what they do and when they do it. And the reason is most of us, we get busy, we forget to do that. But for young people in particular, I think there's some real value in doing that in this context. So I think we're going to stop for a moment and open up for questions for a few minutes before we go on. Jamie.
How can one who works with youth, such as myself, different scenarios, different settings, ethically incorporate these draft counseling principles into their professional life, without bringing in personal opinions and viewpoints, but just kind of help guide, offer a viewpoint, a perspective, in those settings. And I'll give an example. I think I shared it at church the other day, but I worked with first-time offenders, and one of the curriculum questions was, setting up different opinions, different viewpoints for parents versus youth who were attending that training. And one of the curriculum statements was, all youth should be drafted into the military. And so then they had the opportunity to give their opinion about why they would or would not want to be drafted, or why they believe that, for example, everyone should go through basic training but not necessarily be drafted. And so those were spaces that I found that I could offer some different perspectives, and I did. But how do you see? I just feel like it's a fine line, but how do you see that playing out?
That's a really good question. I will say I don't necessarily have the answer to this one, and I think that I think some of the educators, people who work with youth, might have a better idea of what's possible in different settings. I will say that right now in Oklahoma, of course, there's a lot of folks who have a lot of job uncertainty right now in certain fields, and so I want to say that I personally think I think it's very situational, is what you can do and what you can't do.
The question in general that someone was asking in the chat, just to get a context.
Okay, so the question was asked in the room for people that work with youth, either in an educational setting or in other kinds of setting. How can you talk about issues related to the draft and talk about these moral and ethical issues in ways that doesn't violate your professional obligations, or doing something that would cause you to lose your employment? And my short answer is that that's very situational, depends on your workplace, what you can get away with. What I would say as a general rule, though, is I think especially by embracing the principle of non-directive counseling, I think that puts you in a much better position, because when you're engaged in non-directive counseling, you're not telling anyone what to do. And I think because of that, I think by framing it in that kind of way, and also framing it as asking questions is always, so in other words, you're not say, have you thought about this? Or what do you think about this? Or I think that's one tool. But I do think I'm hoping we're going to touch on this a lot more in some of the future trainings, because I think that's going to come up a lot more. So thank you so much for asking that. Okay, any other questions before we go on? Yes.
So as people are documenting their pushing thoughts, is this stuff that needs to be publicized for it to have a point on it?
So what someone asked in the room, if someone writes their personal thoughts down as part of this documentation, does it need to be publicized or something like that to the timestamp? Not necessarily. I would say it's really helpful if there is a way of getting a timestamp somehow, some way. So there's a few ways to do that. One, of course, is to draft something and then submit it to an organization that has it on file. That can be a really useful approach. I know another approach, kind of old school, but I've known people that have taken would write up what they believe about something. They put it in an envelope, seal it, mail it to themselves. They don't open it. They save it to actually hand at the draft and say, hey, let's now open this. This is sealed, it's postmarked. You can do that. So it doesn't have to be shared publicly. I would say that for some young people who are maybe I could see there being some advantages sometimes to doing it publicly, though, because it's going to show credit, it's going to show sincerity, that you're willing to take a chance by speaking out publicly about something. But that's not for everybody, and it's not necessary. Lance?
And even most Christian religious denominations that are historically peace churches, they walk both sides. Says, yeah, you can be pro-war, you can be pacifist. We'll take your record and hold it for you.
Absolutely. And Father Lance, he just shared that a lot of religious denominations, even ones that may not be traditional peace churches, would be willing to keep on record that what your beliefs are. And that's a very common. And I would also say, even in traditions you may not think of as being traditional peace churches, there will be pockets within those organizations that may be more oriented that way. So, for instance, I know the Presbyterian Church is a Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. I know the Baptist Church is a Baptist Peace Fellowship. And then often these organizations also will have resources that are aimed at that tradition. For instance, heroes and saints from that tradition speaking about these issues, which is very helpful later if you're preparing to show from your tradition that maybe it's not the majority position within it, but there are people who believe in conscientious objection within it. Also, I'll mention in the chat, Ed put the National Network Opposing the Militarization of Youth, NOMI, NNOMY.org, has resources for educators and facilitators of youth groups, although more about current recruiting and enlistment than a possible future draft. Yes, I strongly recommend NOMI is a really good source of resources. Okay, well, continuing onward, let's look. We're going to share a screen again because we've got to jump back into the regs. We're going to look at one of the more squirrely of in my opinion, of the possibility for exemptions, because there are some major problems constitutionally with this one, and that is the classifications of registrants preparing for the ministry and the classifications of ministers of religion. So let's look at ministers of religion first, which is 1645. Here is what it says. The term duly ordained minister of religion means a person who has, one, been ordained in accordance with the ceremonial, ritual, or discipline of a church, religious sect, or organization established on the basis of a community of faith and belief, doctrines, and practices of a religious character, and two, who preaches and teaches the doctrine of such church, sect, or organization, and three, who administers the rites and ceremonies thereof in public worship, and four, who as his regular and customary vocation preaches and teaches the principles of religion, and five, who administers the ordinances of public worship as embodied in the creed or principles of such church, sect, or organization. Now, here's the problem. If we jump down a little bit, it says three. It says the term regular or duly ordained minister of religion does not include, one, the person who irregularly or incidentally preaches and teaches the principles of religion, church, religious sect, or organization, or two, any person who's been duly ordained a minister in accordance with the ceremonial rite or discipline of a church, religious sect, or organization, but who does not regularly, as a bona fide vocation, teach and preach the principles of religion and administer the ordinances of public worship as yada, yada, yada. And it finally says, four, the term vocation denotes one's regular calling or full-time profession. So there's some big problems here. To begin with, and again, I have a lot of Mennonites who are on Zoom and we're watching later. Most Mennonite pastors today are bivocational. There's very few Mennonite pastors today who do that, who their only gig is being a Mennonite pastor. That's the reality. And it's the reality for a lot of religious denominations today. Depending on how you read this, ministers who are bivocational may or may not qualify. I also would argue that there's some First Amendment Establishment Clause issues here. The government's effectively trying to define what religion is, which is a major problem, which is why I think this particular exemption if it is administered in too restrictive of a way, there will be court challenges, and they should be. Now, what about more extreme cases? For instance, you or anyone in the room could go online right now, Universal Life Church, and get ordained minutes. True story. Lots of us do it to be able to perform weddings and things like that. Those ordinations have been recognized by almost every state in the United States as valid for officiating a wedding. Would they be qualified? Under this regulation, no. But I would argue constitutionally, I don't think it's the government's place myself to say that ordination doesn't count. Also, if we jump over to the regulation that governs ministerial students, which is under Part 1639, let's read something else interesting here. When it talks about it says that, so it's a basis for classification in Class 2D. Says in Class 2D should replace any registrant who is preparing for the ministry under the direction of a recognized church or religious organization and one who is satisfactorily pursuing a full-time course of instruction. Goes on more about full-time. So what about part-timers? When I went to seminary, I went part-time. Most people, high number of people these days who go to seminary, go part-time. A strict read of this regulation would indicate that's not good enough. Who knows how they're going to interpret this? I bring all this up to say that there's some real problems. I would also throw out there, what about Quakers? The Quaker tradition, particularly for unprogrammed Quakers, do not have ordained clergy in the traditional sense of the word. Even someone who is a friend of weight, and what they call them, someone who's doing Quaker stuff all the time, who might be, for all practical purposes, treated as a minister in the outside world, but they technically are not clergy for Quakers. According to this, they wouldn't qualify. So I think there's some major problems here. Myself, I would recommend for any religious minister who wants to pursue this in the event of a draft is be ready for the fight. But I also think there's some lawyers who would love to take this up on First Amendment grounds, and I think there's some avenue to go there. So what would be some of the evidence that could be used in this case? Ordination certificate, graduation certificate from seminary, a resume or a CV, letters from religious communities. Those would all be appropriate parts of documentation. Well, we now have 10 minutes left, so I want to have a few closing remarks, and then if we have any time left, with a little bit more time for questions. I do want to mention a couple things. We will have our 201 class, which will focus more on the active draft stage. Will be happening in March. We do not have a date for that yet. We will have it very, very soon. If you registered for this, we will send out an email with the next date. We'll have another training in April. It's going to involve advanced subjects, and also we're especially focusing on medical professionals in the third session. In the meantime, though, if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. Those of you who registered via online, you probably had an email from me, so feel free to email me anytime. Also, keep an eye out. For those of you who did register, I will be sending an email soon about an opportunity to receive an email newsletter for draft counselors. So we're getting that set up. Also, I am going to be launching a website this week, draftcounseling.org. That's going to be providing a lot more resources. We'll have links to the videos, but a lot more resources will be available there. And what we're hoping is, to be honest, this is a shot in the dark. We're trying to get the ball rolling, but my hope is that this can spread, that in the Vietnam era, it was a decentralized network that made this happen. Over time, there were more organized structure, but initially it was just people saying, we got to do something. Well, we're in that place now. We got to do something. But my hope is, as we can continue to work together, we continue to collaborate, we can eventually build out a full network, nationwide network of draft counselors to be ready for whatever this administration or future administrations throws at us. And lastly, I'll mention that if you are here locally, or if you want to watch online, either way, starting at 3:30, Joy Mennonite will be having this afternoon service, and Ralph Edgar, a Vietnam era conscience objector, will be speaking at that service. So that's coming up at 3:30. But in the meantime, we got 8 minutes left, and so if there's any more questions, comments, etc., now's the time. So, and I'm going to stop share. For writing, are you meaning the letter? Oh, yes, yes, yes. I will put that. Yes, I will put those links, and we have several links to get in there, but we'll put those in the chat right now. So this first one is CCW Guide Workbook. But I'll also put in the chat the very important Code of Federal Regulations that deals with the Selective Service System. And then the other thing we'll put in the chat is the DOTI, or I guess I should say the DOE, that governs the medical standards. And I'll also mention throughout this, we really are, this is an introductory. There's a lot of detail here. There's a lot more we could go into. We're really hitting the high points here. So
I do have a detailed question.
sure.
Okay, so I had read before that, especially during the Vietnam War, sometimes they have issues with draftees considered physically unfit due to BMI or something like that, and judges would give them an amount of time to get to an acceptable BMI. They sometimes would or would not. Do you think that's still a thing, or
yes?
Okay,
it will absolutely be a thing, and that is the question was asked about. What about BMI? In other words, if someone is their BMI is too high, they're obese, and yes, that will be a major disqualifying factor. So absolutely.
You spoke briefly about there being a movement for abolishing selective service.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, Ed, we had a question from the room about the movement to abolish the selective service, and ask if you could speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, thank you. As I said, the change that was enacted in December of last year was really a response to the recognition that the current registration system was unfit for purpose. The proposal to replace it with an automatic registration system rather than to eliminate it entirely was basically a sort of Hail Mary pass from the Selective Service staff who didn't want to lose their jobs, which has been a fairly, cushy, do-nothing sinecure for many years. And it really didn't have, there was no debate, there were no hearings, there was no budget proposal. It's not clear, like, how well prepared they are for it. And it doesn't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny. As I said earlier, it's working from these other databases, they don't really have the information that they would need to have to actually get a list of everybody who's eligible for the draft, much less where they all live. So I think there is a real opportunity. There's not a lot of hard support for registration or a good justification for registration. There's even less justification for a registration scheme that doesn't work and would be equally unfit for purpose. And so, although that was more or less snuck into this massive 3,000-page defense bill last year, I think if we can get some more focused scrutiny this year, I think the argument is, look, you were right to recognize, Congress, that the current system had failed, but trying to get Selective Service to go on this vast data grab and aggregate all this data from other places and collect a list that would include, for example, because registration depends on your sex is assigned at birth, they're going to have to do gender witch hunting of trans and non-binary youth to figure out who's supposed to be drafted. Because if you're a non-US citizen, whether you're supposed to be drafted depends on your visa status. So they've got a mandate to try to construct a list of the addresses of every undocumented young immigrant man, which, this is data that's very much subject to weaponization. I think there's a lot of reasons why, if we can generate a public debate, I think there's a real chance of getting the system ended entirely. not on the basis of whether or not we want a draft, but on the basis of the fact that it's just not feasible. And, you have to face reality. There's this ironic thing that people who are supporting peace and opposing preparations for war are naive. I think the naive people who are thinking that they're actually going to have a workable draft based on either the current registration list or the automatic registration. So there was a bill that got bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate a couple of years ago when it was more actively considered. We're looking for people in Congress to reintroduce it this year, recognizing, as James alluded to at the start of this whole presentation, the fact that there is, renewed saber rattling and threats, which even if a draft isn't activated, the draft enables, part of the threat arsenal. And I think from many directions, for many reasons, mistrust both of the federal government's military posture and mistrust of how the government might weaponize this sort of data. I think we have real chances this year of, winning, not a final victory. The draft is always going to be an idea that will percolate back up, but putting an end to the Selective Service system entirely. But I think it's going to take building a broader coalition, and it's going to take people. This is not an idea that's going to occur spontaneously in Congress. They don't see this as an issue. A lot of them think, well, there's no immediate threat of a draft, so why should we care? Getting them to understand that preparation for a draft enables warmongering, that the list contains data that could be weaponized, especially against immigrant and trans and non-binary youth, is going to be key to the success of this.
Thank you, Ed. Sorry about that. Well, I think we are at our time, so I just want to thank everyone so much for participating, especially thank for everyone here at Join Mennonite for being such gracious hosts. And again, keep an eye on your emails. Coming in just a few days, we'll have some information about the March training, as well as some of the resources that are available. So again, we thank everyone so much and look forward to seeing you again a month from now.